Race and Sexism in Sports by Courtney, Merrill, Ximena, Zuniga, Krishan, Kapoor, Prisila, Diaz, and Diaz.
Does the systemic role of racism and sexism have an effect on the access and treatment of experiences in sport? We believe both roles of racism and sexism have multiple effects on how people are treated in sport and how they are able to experience it, such as coaches profiting from players, women's sports lacking funding, and the mental strain for minorities. When looking at the history of sports, it is evident that white men have had hold over most significant positions. This can be seen as a problem because coaches are making a profit from their players who in many sports are not Caucasian. Billy Hawkins argues that the control over the black male's body and profiting off its physical expenditure is in the hands of white males. In a study done by the National Bureau of Economic Research, they collected the expense data from the NCAA, which included all 65 athletic programs from 2006 to 2019. The study found the average annual salary of football coaching staffs nearly doubles, from $4.8 million to $9.8 million. Non-coaching administrative salaries nearly doubled as well. But financial support for the athletes, primarily tuition aid, room and board, grew 47%. This information shows how coaches are making more off the success of their players, while the players end up having to pay more money in tuition in order to play. Rather than paying the coaches such large salaries based on the team's performance, some of the money could be distributed to the school or sports program as a whole.
Racism and sexism have created mental and physical barriers for minorities involved in the sports community. Racism in sports at a higher level are not typically between athletes, but it is more common that fans will behave recklessly and racially profile athletes on the opposing team. This is not only a problem in minorities in the US, but also some European sports teams with conflicting religious beliefs. This discrimination can cause athletes to carry a burden and eventually lead to burnout. In nearly all sports, female teams receive less coverage than their male counterparts. Most examples of sexism in female sports stem from fans making sexist remarks on social media and during sporting events. Gender pay gap and sexist comments towards women in sports can lead to not only emotional stress, but similar to racism, can lead to early burnout.
Use your voice. Today we live in a world where sexism and racism is something we are not afraid to speak up about. For example, the Me Too movement recently arose and now has thousands of supporters. Another significant movement that really gained support over the summer is the Black Lives Matter movement. Both of these are examples of just how much speaking up can make a difference. For example, in 2019, the women's hockey team fought for more games and they were able to increase their season by 24 games. Recently, the United States women's soccer team spoke up about the gender discrimination and sued their whole governing body. Sexism in sports can be seen in two categories, one being less funding and the other being smaller crowds. For less funding, although Title IX was established to provide everyone an equal opportunity in sports, it is not required to spend the same amount of finance on men's and women's sports programs. According to Forbes, the NCAA gives the men's teams conference over $1.6 million for each win, while the women's teams get absolutely nothing for their wins. For the smaller crowds, most of the times women's sports have a smaller crowd due to lack of coverage, not because of a lack of interest. In a 25-year-long study research, it was shown that local news outlets spent only 3% of the airtime covering women's sports, with ESPN allocating a mere 2% of its coverage. Women's sports gets less media coverage and airtime than men's sports do. There is a systematic sexism in sports that leads to unequal funding and unequal media coverage.